Hey guys, what's up? It is Public, back with another video on the ginormous Shadow Priest rework that we just got. So I know I just did a video kind of just walking through the blue post, but after playing with it for the first couple of days, I kind of wanted to do another video just going over specifically, one, what changed, my initial reactions to that, show you some gameplay footage in the background of how it actually plays. So we're going to go over, exactly what changed, the talent changes that we have, some build options that we have. And I'm going to take the end of the video to kind of talk about, what do I like about the spec? What's fun to play about it? Maybe some things I'd like to see them change or do a little bit differently. But guys, honestly, TLDR, it's really fun to play. I'm loving the rework. I think it has an amazing base to go off from. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so first things first, let's go over the changes. So starting off with Void Form, this is the largest change that I mentioned before. So Void Form is now a cooldown baseline to the spec, so you actually, you don't constantly go in and out of Void Form all the time. So now that it's a cooldown, it now does 20% increased damage for 15 seconds. So if you remember before, we also have Shadow Form. So Shadow Form buffs us by 10%. So Void Form is actually only increasing our damage by an extra 10%. So in total, everything it's buffed by 20% for 15 seconds. So not the best, but it's something. It's a cooldown, and it's only a minute and a half, which is the important thing, right? So it's not super critical to our damage necessarily, but it is a good part of it. It helps us do a big spike of damage. Now, part of this change, they also made Void Eruption baseline's cast time reduced by 40%, kind of bringing that change over from Legacy of the Void. So unfortunately, we still need, at this point, 90 Insanity to get into Void Form. So our cooldown has a cast time and has a resource requirement before we can get into it. And then once we're in it, we have basically infinite Insanity because we start at 90, and then we get access to Void Bolt just like we do now. It then resets the cooldown of Mind Blast and then gives it 2 charges. So baseline, we only get 1 charge of Mind Blast. There's no more talent to buff that. But when you go into Void Form, you do get 2 uses of Mind Blast. So we basically get overloaded with like infinite resources. We have a ton of things to press. It feels a little chaotic, but they could easily tune that down with making maybe Void Eruption castable before 90 Insanity. That might help out a little bit, or just kind of decreasing how much Insanity the spec is generating right now, because it's kind of insane. And another kind of 2 points here. So Void Form no longer gives you stacking haste. Once you're in it, that's it. There's a talent that we can take, which we'll get to in just a second, that does give you kind of decaying critical strike once you enter Void Form. So very similar to Course of Insanity, but now instead of exiting your Void Form getting the crit, it's when you get in. And so that's kind of the big change with the spec is Void Form. So we have this cooldown with our spec. It's a little interesting to play with. It's not super crazy, but honestly, it makes our damage pattern actually flow a bit nicer in my opinion. So I'm very much pro of this change. Okay, guys, next up we got Devouring Plague back. I know I've mentioned this before in several videos, but if you've just been now tuning into Shadow Priest, welcome. We now have Devouring Plague back as a dot. So with the rework, this is very much apparent. This is basically where most of our damage is. When I was doing raid testing earlier, or just like leveling on my priests, this is like easily like 40% of my damage, if not higher, if you maintain solid uptime. I don't know, in fights, especially single target, getting like 80%, 85, 90% uptime is pretty doable. But the trick is here, it actually costs Insanity, right? So we are that traditional builder spender spec. We have a lot of our spells that give us Insanity, and we spend that on Devouring Plague, right? So this is actually the only quote-unquote spender that we have baseline to the spec, although getting into Void Form does cost or require Insanity to get in. So you basically just use, whatever Insanity you have to dump into Devouring Plague without capping. Now there is a talent that is another AoE spender of Insanity, which we'll get to in a second, but right now this is basically where most of our damage is. It's now a 6-second dot and deals quite a good chunk of damage as an initial hit, and that's kind of what the design is right now. So that's Devouring Plague. It's kind of interesting. We're probably casting it too often now. It is a little clunky as well, because since we are kind of have like infinite Insanity, we have a ton, especially during Void Form. You kind of like munch the cooldown a little bit, or the duration on your target. So it would be nice if they gave this either like the Ignite treatment, or say we can have multiple Devouring Plagues on one target, or maybe even it extends the duration, something like that. Because right now we're kind of wasting some damage right now by doing this. We're spending our Insanity, but it's kind of going nowhere because it's just refreshing to the pandemic window of the dot, and that's it. So still hits like a truck though, so it's very, very big spell. Okay, guys, another big addition to the spec. They give us a new baseline passive called Dark Thoughts. Very, very similar to the old talent that's now removed called Shadowy Insight. Basically, your shadow damage over time effects on the target that your Mind Flayer, Mind Seer are hitting have a 2% chance per dot to give you a trigger, a buff of Dark Thought. So, and what this is, it's an instant cast Mind Blast, right? So basically, if you have all these dots out on your targets and you're mind searing them for each time that's ticking, you have a chance to give you a charge of a free Mind Blast. The cool thing with this is that you can actually cast that free Mind Blast, on the move or while channeling Mind Seer or Mind Flay. And this can also stack up to 5 times. So you get to kind of bank up the charges of Mind Blast and kind of use them when you need to maybe move, for example, or just kind of tunnel into a target. Like I said, I think the idea of this is really solid, but it does have some quirks. The main ones right now is, Mind Flay and Mind Seer channel durations are really short. So, that's kind of weird to play around this. And also, I just don't get a lot of procs on single target. On AoE, I feel like I'm getting a reasonable amount of these, and they kind of are all over the place. But in single target, I could go like minutes or, even a whole fight or a pull of a boss, and I didn't get any procs. Part of that's because we just have so much other things to cast that we're not mind flaying as often. But, the fact that this isn't proccing very much, especially out of Void form, feels bad. So I think they should buff the proc rate a little bit, at least on Mind Flay. And secondly, in the blue post where they added this, they actually suggested that we could actually bank up these charges since it does stack up to 5. But because I'm not getting very many procs, it's not really possible. And even if I was getting procs, the buff only lasts 6 seconds. So if they just increase that buff to last a little bit longer, adjust the proc rate on Mind Flay, this is really fun to play with. I mean, when you get a proc, it's pretty beefy. So very interesting passive. It's really close to getting there. Hopefully they get kind of small changes to kind of finish and smooth it out. Okay, guys, we had some other smaller changes as well going into Shadowlands for the spec. So the Mind Blast cooldown was fixed. They did kind of inadvertently revert that change they made, but Mind Blast is now synced up with the global cooldown, so that was great. So even though we don't have 2 charges of Mind Blast baseline, it is still fine to press just having the 1 charge. They also did change it, so Shadow or Death, which we do have baseline now, does not generate Insanity baseline, right? They also did adjust the damage coefficients of it to where it does significantly more damage when the target is below 20%. But I don't think we're super incentivized to use it above that at all. So when I was doing raid testing, I was pretty much just using this as like, I have to move. I don't have a free Mind Blast proc. I don't have Devouring Plague. Let me go ahead and use Shadow or Death as just like doing something on the move. So it fills that gap pretty nicely since we don't have Void Bolt or access to Void Bolt as often. But man, does this hit hard and execute. I'm glad because, I want an ability that like feels really chunky when the target doesn't execute. It's just, depending on how, quick the ad dies, 20% is a pretty short window to react to, but it can still be pretty solid. And guys, lastly, the big change to the spec and from a baseline perspective was our shadowy apparitions. This is actually a huge change. So before it was our critical strikes of our dots. Historically, it's just been Shadow Word Pain. Have a chance to spawn a shadowy apparition. And then we could talent into Auspicious Spirits, making those do more damage and giving us Insanity when they hit the target. So they left the talent in, but they reworked the base thing that actually procs apparitions. So it's no longer tied to Shadow Word Pain. Now it is, when you use Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, or Void Bolt, you instantly create a shadowy version of yourself, right? You instantly spawn something. It has nothing to do with crit at all. You instantly get one. However, you have to have Vampiric Touch on that target to proc it, right? So if I have 3 targets, if I have Vampiric Touch on all 3, if I use Mind Blast, that's 1 spirit on each target, right? And the big thing is, if that Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, or Void Bolt is a critical strike, then I then spawn 2 apparitions per target that has Vampiric Touch on it. So they really kind of fully loaded into VT here as our dot of choice, more or less. But, and man, you really do see the impact. Even without the talent, this was doing significantly more damage than in the previous builds that we had. So very nice to see. It is like a little crazy. You get almost too many spirits right now, and it gets kind of nuts on multi-target, especially if you can refresh your dots very well. But it's a pretty fun change to play with, and safe to say that spirits are sticking around. So, all right, guys, and then the last thing I want to mention of the changes that we have, I'm not going to really go over them too much here. We did get Power Infusion baseline, so we have a static haste buff that we can cast on ourselves or others. We also have Desperate Prayer and Mind Soothe, and we also get Shadow or Death baseline like I mentioned before. So lots of baseline changes to the spec. Not sure what all this is going to add to our toolkit. Mind Soothe is very interesting because it might allow us to, let the group skip a pack in Mythic Plus, which is kind of cool. So we'll see where that goes. Power Infusion, I think, still needs some work. With Power Infusion, we basically have Power Infusion, Shadow Fiend, and Void Form as a cooldown. And then if you talent into Surrender to Madness, that's a second Void Form that you get to use. So the spec is kind of overflowing with cooldowns right now, so unsure how we'll stack those together or how that will work, but that's what we have baseline. Alright guys, now the biggest change that I think they made to the spec that gives us a ton of options is our talent tree. So I think, myself included, have been really complaining about the talent tree not giving us a lot of options. I think they've solved that. There's some iteration work to be done here, but I think this is a really good start. So getting started with the level 15 row, we now have between Fortress of the Mind, Death and Madness, or a new option, Unfurling Darkness, which basically means if you want, consistent single target damage, you have an option with Fortress of the Mind. If you have a fight that has, adds that are a bit beefier but can be sniped pretty easily, Death and Madness is the way to go there. The only problem is, unfortunately, it's still bugged to where if that Shadow or Death kills your target, you don't get the reset. So hopefully they fix that as soon as possible. And then the new option, Unfurling Darkness. So after casting Vampiric Touch on a target, your next Vampiric Touch is instant cast and deals a big amount of spell power damage instantly. It can only occur every 15 seconds though. And yes, the good part about this is it does work with Misery, so you can kind of, add some benefit there. And it can proc off itself, so you can actually bank up this proc and get 2 back-to-back, which is pretty cool. Because the buff of Unfurling Darkness is infinite, so you don't have to spend it like right away or whatever. You can literally drop out of combat, log out of the game, and come back in and you still have it. So at least on beta, that's how it's working. Moving on, level 25 row. Unfortunately, nothing changed here. I wish they would kind of, take the time to make this more of like a defined utility row, but, is what it is. They could add some movement here or whatever. I'll talk about utility options in a second, though. Level 30 row, a bit of a change here. So we still have Twisted Fate and Misery, but now instead of Dark Void, we have Searing Nightmare, which is basically just a super buffed version of Dark Void. So it instantly deals damage to the target. It does cost 30 Insanity, so this is our AoE Insanity spender if you take this talent. Cost Insanity and puts Shadowed Pain on targets in that area. But if that target already has Shadowed Pain, it does double damage. Now, the trick with this ability, because it does sound quite broken, there's no cooldown on it, you can only cast it while channeling Mindseer, right? And depending on your levels of haste and where you're casting it in the channel, you can only get about, 2 of these casts in per channel of Mindseer. So, again, I wish that Mindseer was a bit longer so that I could, put more of these out, because you're literally just fighting with the GCD here of like, okay, Mindseer on the GCD, then use Searing Nightmare, and then use it again. And, hopefully you have enough Insanity to cast that. 60 Insanity is not that much. If there's enough targets, you're generating that passively with Mindseer anyway. But man, does this ability do a ton of damage. Not only is it a good way to spread Shadowed Pain, which is our only way to really do that right now, it does a ton of damage. So the Mindseer channel part is a little interesting. If they could increase the duration on that a little bit, should help out. They did something similar with Mindflay, which I think, again, they could increase both, honestly, at this point, but is what it is. Okay, moving on, level 35 row. Again, no changes here. I wish Mind Bomb was a stun. I wish they thought about, making Last Word more baseline, because, our interrupt stinks. Maybe putting something else here, like making Shackle and Dead better, or adding Spectral Guys in. There are a lot of options here they could do, but sadly unchanged. Okay, moving on, level 40 row. So Auspicious Spirits, Shadow Crash are unchanged. However, because of this, the Shadow Apparition rework, AS is quite different now, and will probably be the go-to option if we want really that, single target damage. And then if there's a clumped AoE fight, that's where Shadow Crash is great for. But the new option, which is really intriguing, is Psychic Link. This is actually an old PvP talent they brought back. So Mind Blast deals 60% of its damage to all targets afflicted by your Vampiric Touch within 40 yards, right? 40 yards is a huge range, so you pair this up with Misery and Unfurling Darkness, and you're just a Vampiric Touch machine, really. And then your Mind Blast now hit everything, right? Obviously not full damage, but still very strong. So they did buff the damage going to the spell. It was only 20%, I believe, as a PvP talent, so they did make it a bit harder. So excited to try this out in Mythic Plus, honestly. It sounds like it's going to be a monster. And then moving on to the level 45 row, big changes in this row as well. So Mindbender has stayed the same. However, we now have a new option called Damnation, which instantly afflicts a target with all 3 of our dots, Shadowed Pain, Vampiric Touch, and Devouring Plague, free of cost. It's a 45-second cooldown. And it is instant cast. Now, just to note that this is kind of weird. It is proccing some things like Unfurling Darkness, so there is that. But, it's there. I think this is particularly helpful if you do want to kind of multi-target dot things, because getting that instant cast is nice. But the other option, again, very intriguing here, is Void Torrent, which now generates 60 Insanity over that 4-second channel. And then while you're channeling it, refreshes the dots back to their full duration. Now, right now, this is bugged on beta, but assuming it does work out correctly, you can boost up Shadowed Pain, Vampiric Touch, and Devouring Plague during this 4-second channel back to their full duration. It's a pretty great ability. The only kind of weird part is, since it generates so much insanity, as soon as you end the channel, you immediately want to spend some insanity to refresh Devouring Plague again. So you're kind of just a Devouring Plague machine with this guy. So very interesting. Unsure how much use either of these two talents will get, just because, you know, we have a legendary that buffs Mindbender and a conduit that buffs Mindbender, and then also Fey Blessings if you're a Night Fey. So I think Mindbender right now is the star of the show, but, you know, balance pending. We'll see what happens. Okay, and the last talent row that we're going to go over real quick is the level 50 row. So we have a new option called Ancient Madness. This is actually replacing Dark Ascension. Ancient Madness, entering Void form increases your critical strike by 30% for 15 seconds, but you reduce 2% every second as Void form ends. So again, you just get a giant burst of crit start of your Void form, which is, you know, pretty helpful. If you like want to burst down AoE attack, you go into Void form, you get 10% extra damage from base Void form itself, and now you do extra crit, or you have extra critical strike, right? It's pretty great. Honestly, this is kind of the go-to option for me for what I'm testing right now, but we'll see what happens. They also reworked Legacy of the Void. It still gives you an extra 5% damage modifier, so Void form becomes plus 15% instead of plus 10. But Void form no longer has a duration, so with the rework, right, Void form only lasts that 15 seconds of the cooldown. But now with Legacy, you can now stay in Void form as long as you can keep up. You're kind of back to that old style where you're fighting against that insanity drain. The only problem is, like, if you drop out, like, you lose it, right? You can't go back in. Void form still has a cooldown with Legacy of the Void, right? But the issue is you can't really push stacks very much, because at that point you're not really gaining much. Like, sure, you get 10% extra damage, and then access to Void Bolt, and, you know, you get your 2 charges of Mind Blast, but, you know, that's it, right? It's not really doing much, but it's actually costing you Devouring Plague, right? Because once you get above that same kind of 20 stack mark that we had before with this problem, casting Devouring Plague makes you fall out of it, right? Which kind of defeats the purpose of the talent. Like, you want to kind of stay in Void form as long as possible. So hopefully this gets reworked to kind of rethought, because I'm not sure it fits into this model. Kind of feels like a waste of a talent, to be honest. And then lastly, Surrender to Madness, which, again, I think I see where they're going here with this. This is actually a much better spell with the rework, because it basically gives you a second cooldown, right? You have your normal Void form that you can go into, or you can press Surrender to Madness, instantly gain 100 insanity, and put you in Void form, right? The caveat is you have to kill the target that you put it on, otherwise you die, right? And you only have 25 seconds to do that. And, you know, while you're in this, you know, your abilities generate more insanity, which is more Devouring Plagues, and you can cast while moving. So this actually feels pretty busted with a new build. I haven't really got a chance to play with it yet, but I think especially in a Mythic Plus environment, or any fight where there's a controlled amount of ads that live for, I mean, honestly, you want them to live up to 24 seconds or 25 seconds, right? So that you get maximum uptime. But as long as they live, like, I don't know, 15, 20 seconds, you're getting a good amount of benefit here. That's a lot of Devouring Plays you can get out with this talent. So it's a little tricky. I almost wish it had, you know, maybe a reworked cooldown, but the target, you know, if the target dies, you keep the buff for, like, some static duration. Because right now it's kind of, it's pretty feels bad if you want to, like, snipe a target with this and Shadow or Death, then you lose the benefit. But so it has potential. It just has some weird problems or caveats where I'm not sure it's worth the risk of dying here, but we'll see when we get to more raid testing and Mythic Plus. All right, guys, so that's all for the talent changes. Okay, guys, before I end this video, I want to cover a good section of time about what I think they've done really well, problems with the spec, etc., things like that. So starting off, like, with problems, or at least a lot of questions that I've been asking, is a lot of people asking, well, is it boring to play? Is single target boring without Void form? And honestly, guys, after doing raid testing today, my answer is no. It's actually fine. You're casting enough things to where it doesn't feel boring. And, you know, if there's ever an ad that spawns, you're like, oh my gosh, I have so much to do. There's a lot involved here. Sure, you're chugging out a lot of Devouring Plagues, but man, you're pumping out all that damage. Feels good. Now, I do wish the procs were more apparent, because on single target, there are some kind of dips in your rotation where, like, you don't have Mindbender, you don't have Void Torrent, so you're kind of waffling between, I really need Insanity or having too much. But I think if they tune that baseline proc of Dark Thoughts, I think they can fix that pretty easily. The other big question I've been getting asked is about mobility problems with the spec. I actually don't think it's that bad. Of course, our mobility in Void form kind of remains unchanged, because we can just cast Void Bolt and Stutter Step. But outside of that, because we're casting Devouring Plague so much and getting these instant proc Mind Blasts, you effectively can use those to Stutter Step, although not to the same degree, but we have so many instant cast abilities that we're just waiting for the GCD for that you're fine to use it to Stutter Step as well. I didn't really see this as a problem. And you do have Shadow or Death as like a backup ability here. You know, if you're talenting into Shadow Crash or whatever, Mindbender, you have a lot of GCDs that you're pushing that you can use to move on the go. So I don't think that's a really big problem. Now, the next thing, you know, I think I've mentioned this before. I think, you know, Power Infusion is weird. We did get it added back to the spec, but we are now kind of a triple cooldown spec baseline, right? No talents. We have Void Form, Power Infusion, and Shadow Fiend or Mindbender. And I think it might be too much. That might be too much to juggle just because we're effectively just going to be like, okay, I'm just going to line all these up and push them at the same time. That's kind of what we want to do, right? Mindbender Shadow Fiend does break the mold a little bit because of the Legendary, because of the Conduit and Fey Blessings that you go Mindbender, you can just kind of use that on cooldown. Although I think that relationship is a bit unhealthy balance-wise, so we'll see if that stays in. But, you know, especially if you're not using Mindbender, you know, if you don't line up those cooldowns, you're missing out on a lot, and I don't know if that gives us a lot of value or depth in our rotation. They did remove haste baseline to the spec, so I like the idea of, like, pressing something, getting a lot of haste, and kind of going insane, so to speak. I'd rather instead they made, like, Power Infusion either put it onto a talent or bake it into something else, or make it, like, just part of Void Form rather than be a separate button, because I don't even like thinking about using Power Infusion on someone else. It's just not even something I want to deal with, so prefer they change that. Okay, and then the bigger problem that I'm, you know, still really eager for changes on, which we haven't gotten yet, and I know, you know, beggars can't be choosers here, but I want to bring it up, is utility, right? We still don't have a lot of great utility Mythic Plus, as we've seen so far. We did get Mind Soothe added back, which, you know, might help us skip packs, but that's very TBD on the dungeons themselves. The only other thing we really have from dungeon utility perspective is we can mass dispel some things, whether it's bursting now that's changed or something else. But again, I don't think that's really what we need. I really think we need some kind of like CC, like make Shackle and Dead work on, say, humanoids, for example, to give it more kind of general use in the dungeon. Maybe give us some kind of like Dark Hole or like Ursula's Vortex-esque mechanic, but for Shadow Priest. I mean, something, right? I think our level 25 and 35 talent rows have some options that could either get removed or made baseline to the spec or changed. I think it's time to use some of those options to really fill out our utility or the spec. Okay, and then the last thing, guys, is, you know, some people like, some people don't. We're now a dot class, right? We're truly a dot class again, where you do have to think about maintaining your dots up on multiple targets. Some people don't like that. Some people are kind of meh about it. Personally, I think it's kind of exciting. It makes dots or casting dots more important than they used to be, because before it'd be like, well, single target fight, you put your dots up once, Void Bolt does the rest. It's not really true anymore, right? So the spec kind of has an extra dimension that's been added back into the game for us, and I actually think that's pretty exciting. So that's kind of what I've wanted to go over real quick as far as the problems or questions I've been getting asked. All right, guys, that's really all I have left to cover in this video. The spec is really fun to play. I put a lot of footage in the background of me on a training dummy, and look for more footage coming out with the raid testing that I've done. But honestly, I'm having a great time playing the spec. I need to level some more to get some better feedback on it, do some dungeons with it, all that good stuff. So look for videos coming out about the raid testing, about the dungeons. But honestly, if they just, you know, add a couple things, you know, fix some bugs with some talents, maybe give us an AoE Insanity Spender baseline, add some more utility, the spec is in a great spot. And man, is it fun to play. And it's probably going to be a monster in terms of like Mythic Plus or AoE damage, which is going to be pretty interesting to see. So who knows? I'm excited. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed. See you in the next one.